So without further ado, I'm going to change hands and put you in the most capable hands of Dr. Catherine Quinlan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rana. Dr. Robinson Hill, I truly appreciate the introduction. I'm really, really excited about this presentation today, and I want to thank Kadasi members for asking me to present today. And as Dr. Atwater noted, Kadasi is the continental and diasporic Africa in science education rig. Next slide, please. As Rana noted, I am funded to create a STEM curriculum that is representative of Black heritage and more specifically, African Americans in the United States. I'm assistant professor in science education at Howard University School of Education. So thank you for this honor. Next slide, please. So today my talk is titled Going Beyond Ceremony, Creating Educative STEM Materials that Use and Evoke African American Capital. And today I want to make three points today concerning what it would take to actually go beyond ceremony and create educative materials that are representative of African American culture. So I'm going to draw from my insights on my own research. Next slide, please. So the first point I want to make here today is that in order to go beyond ceremony and create educative STEM materials that use and evoke African American capital, the first thing we need to do is include the lived experiences and narratives of Black heritage and of African Americans in implementation and intervention protocols for understanding the nature of science. So today I want to take a different spin on this and talk about the how and the why and the benefits. Next slide, please. And I want to begin by acknowledging and offering my condolences for Dr. Norman Lederman. May he rest in peace. My condolences to him and his family and friends. And I want to say that I have been fascinated by nature of science studies, and I've used it in a lot of my work, even prior to coming to Howard, when I engaged students, high school students, in a lunar planetary institute at NASA. Before and after, I always used nature of science. I use it in my pre-service elementary class at Howard University. And I use it more or less as a Richter scale, as an indicator for me to the extent to which my own pedagogy was effective in allowing students to engage in scientific practices. However, there is, in looking at the research throughout the years, even though I haven't written a separate paper on this, there's one thing that I had been dissatisfied with, mostly because, I don't see it as well in the papers. But what I found missing was an inclusive understanding of the social and cultural embeddedness. Next slide, please. And so I'm drawing from Dr. Lederman et al.'s research in describing what the social and cultural embeddedness is. So I know this is review for some. Science as a human enterprise, I'm quoting, is practiced in the context of a larger culture, and its practitioners are the product of that culture. Science, it follows, affects and is affected by the various elements and intellectual spheres of the culture in which it is embedded. These elements include, but are not limited to, social fabric, power structures, politics, socioeconomic factors, philosophy, and religion. And so I want to take us on a journey of what might this look like? And next slide, please. What can we learn if we add and evoke African American capital and culture? So I'm going to take you on a little journey here and give you some insights into my own research. So this is what I imagine. I imagine an exploration of African rock art image analysis, where we can learn about botany, we can learn about plants, we can learn about African heritage and culture, and intersections between politics, laws, and society, and even technology. One of the examples that come to mind when I think about African rock art image analysis has to do with the work that I've done on the Khoisan indigenous Africans. The onset of technology has really allowed us to see, and the indigenous San, I should say, to see what was happening to their work, DNA samples taken, and let's take the plant Hodia gordoni, which is a plant that indigenous Khoisan Africans use as an appetite suppressant. They found out that pharmaceutical companies here in the US were using it to create a diet pill. long source of controversy where they wrote the sand code of ethics, to which some scientists responded, well, it doesn't really apply to us because we're not in Africa. And so, if we continue on this journey, we even begin to see some of the source of ideas for active ingredients in our own medicine. Take the weeping willow that we use in aspirin today. And so it brings me to one of the conversations I had with Gullah Geechee historian who really talked about the different plants and really enlightened me about earlier on that African Americans and early Africans did not go to doctors. They went to the grannies. And so because they went and they picked plants and they, used their own combination. And so what ended up happening and that he conveyed was people started doctors started wondering what were the grannies using, started following and looking to see what it is that they were using. So we can learn a great deal about medicine, African American culture, the different plants. We can ask questions about hidden figures and African American contributions to space, GPS, Gladys West, Katherine Johnson. Why were they hidden? Why are we now knowing about them? We can look at when I first began this work, like most people do, looking at scientists and inventors. And so one of the patterns I started seeing was that African American patenting inventions took place overseas. And I started wondering, well, why are they patenting overseas? Why are they patenting in the United States? What's going on? We can learn about uh, the onset, and not only the onset, but the experiences of African American Gullah Geechee when it comes to coastal flooding, because African American Gullah Geechee have existed in the coast of South Carolina for over 400 years since they've been here, and they've dealt with observing the receding of the coastline. We can talk about artificial succession, which is one of the things I'll come back and touch on that, actively removing Gullah Geechee African Americans from that area. So there's a great deal that we can learn when it comes to from African Americans, from African heritage, in order to go beyond ceremony and create educative STEM materials. However, this brings me to my second point. In order to do so, we would need to do point number 2. Next slide, please. So we would need to reposition ourselves to have a glass half full and not a glass half empty predisposition when it comes to acknowledging the talents and assets and contributions of African Americans. And I want to touch on the ideas of nature of science. One of the interesting observations I made as I was implementing this in my pre-service class at Howard was just how our students really contextualize understanding about the nature of science, much more than I've read in a lot of journals. And when I say that, I want to emphasize that a lot of the contextualizations happened before we learned the science. And it's not because the science specifically that I was looking at addressed the social and cultural embeddedness, but students gave responses that talked about eugenics, that talked about the impact on perceptions of Blacks, of African Americans, the impact of money. One student mentioned, talked about how medicine is practiced in the US might differ greatly from China. And so I'm giving you an example of the before aspect. So one of the things next slide, please, that I want to emphasize in looking at this from a glass half full is that the experiences of African American students does exemplify this social and cultural embeddedness to the extent that they are able to contextualize those experiences. Because if you look at what the social and cultural embeddedness is, we're talking about the context of a larger society and how it affects and is affected by these various elements, and how that is not limited to social fabric, power structures, politics, socioeconomic factors, who much more than anyone else have to reflect on these perceived differences, not because we want to see it, but often because we're forced to see it, we're forced to experience it, and it becomes integrated, an important part of the fabric of our lives. And so, next slide, please. So it's very important that when it comes to point number 2, I want to highlight some other things. What can we learn? What insights can we gain by repositioning ourselves? And think about this. How many of you like watermelon? How many of you like okra? How many of you like to eat millet? Melons in general, cantaloupes, tamarind, kai apple. Raise your hand if you knew watermelons came from Africa. Cantaloupes came from Africa. One of the things that Judith Carney does talk about quite a bit, I draw a lot of my insights from her work as well, from Carney and Rosenoff's book titled In the Shadows of Slavery. And she talks a lot about how it is that in Western society, we very quickly attribute to changes such as Western society westernizing the African food line. However, we rarely and we don't actually talk about how it is that Africans have Africanized the American food systems and being here and growing foods that they grew up with. Currently in South Carolina, in the Gullah Geechee, one of the things that even Carney highlights, and people now and organization institutions are starting to look into this. They see the parallels between irrigation systems in West Africa and in the South Carolina growing, when there was a lot of, I'm going to say the Gullah Geechee Islands in general, there's a lot of parallels. So people are starting to study what those Gullah Geechee systems are. They're, talking to Gullah Geechee folks down there, trying to find out what was done and why. Why? Because a lot of the changes we have made haven't been as beneficial as we thought. Let's talk about biodiversity, some insights we can gain. One of the things that I really appreciate about the group of researchers from the National Research Council is how they highlighted that oftentimes African crops are compared with crops that grow on more fertile land, but not when they're growing on dry land. However, if you brought those same crops to more fertile land, they prosper. We can learn a lot about biodiversity by repositioning ourselves. And one of the lessons that we've had to learn is the extensive biodiversity that occurred in Africa, that when Westerners came to United States, changed to a more monocultural system, mono-agricultural system, led to the soil depletions. And so it's a lesson we've had to learn that we could have known if we focused on African American assets and repositioned ourselves rather than looking at weaknesses. And so it brings me to my third point. And in order to go beyond ceremony and to create educative STEM materials, we need to understand the impact of nature, discourse, affinity, and institution on our own identity. If we don't understand the impact on our own identity, it's very difficult to reposition ourselves to see the glass half full. So let me talk about one of the things that led me to thinking about this idea is before I came to Howard and was teaching in high school, I had peers who constantly talked about the melting pot. Next slide, please. And they would make comments about why it is these children don't adapt while we came here and we had to, adapt. We had to change our language. And then I started thinking, of course, my imagination went wild, right? Because here you're talking about different people from different cultural backgrounds who are white talking about asking. At that time, I taught a predominantly Latina school. Why don't they, just become a melting pot? And so I kept thinking, well, if we were all melted together, right? If you melt different shades of white, it kind of still looks fairly white. If you melt other colors, it's going to start to look different. And so the question became, are you willing to darken that pot? Are you willing to be open to enjoying and acknowledging those cultural resources? And so I prompted me to do a little digging prior to entering into academia. And around that time, I also started observing how uncomfortable people were starting to get, about having a Black president. I think it's happened so long and everybody enjoyed it. Okay, that's enough. And so I started wondering, where are these ideas coming from? There must be some kind of historical context. It must be reason. I tend to think there's a reason. I mean, I know there's not always a reason for everything, but I tend to approach my life and research that way. Next slide, please. And a lot of it led me to Nell Irvin Painter's book, The History of White People. I don't have anything to gain by advertising her books, but I gained so much insight about the connection between politics, the science, the history, and different cultures and different peoples. And so, one of the things that it led me to, I combined this with other researches, such as, next slide, please, Gee's work. And to really allow you to ask questions such as what influences your concept of self? How do you define yourself? So I wanted to combine this historical context with ideas about identity. And I actually created a course. I had launched it. I had some people test it out. And I did try it out with my students as well. I was just amazed by the responses. And I did have some friends of other cultures and races. And so Guy talked about different impacts on our identity, such as nature or state of being, institutions and our position, discourse, such as an individual trait, as well as affinity. And one of the reasons I actually use that thinking to create an instrument to measure social and cultural self efficacy indicators for persistence of HBCU, I just wanted to pause and highlight that. I'm hoping that's out soon. I was hoping it was out before this talk so I could have shared it, but it's still in press. But the most important thing here is if we don't understand ourselves, if we don't understand all of these influencers and what defines who we are, it's going to be very hard to empathize with others, especially Blacks and African Americans. Next slide, please. So, just give you brief insights into what I've learned and what um, Nell Irvin Painter talked about. One of the things she does, and I went back and I checked myself, looking at ideas about beauty and where those ideas emerged from. I looked at one researcher here, and several researchers have looked at Blumenbach's skull. I just kind of a more recent one I found. And you look at ideas about, examining the skull, looking at beauty, and you can see from different theses here how it is that these ideas have changed over time. You can parallel that with the census, okay, which is something she brought up. If you look at the 1790 census, you see that, their characterizations, right? Free white people, indentured or enslaved. And in the 1850 census, you see, and you can parallel that with the immigration. You start to see ideas about the importance of birth, which state, which country. So really, it helps you thinking about diversity training from an identity perspective will open up a dialogue because we've all been affected by institution, by ideas behind science, ideas. Science has affected our ideas about race. That's something that frequently is talked about. Next slide, please. And so you can parallel that with historical documents. This is not something we talk about. These are all from the Library of Congress. And you get to see how it is our ideas have changed over time. Next slide, please. This is a memoirs I kind of went into just to show you an example that, we could talk about indentured or white slaves as well in understanding your identity in really moving forward in repositioning and understanding the plights of Blacks in the United States. The history is so intertwined. It's not separate, and yet we talk about it as if it's separate. The third point, I'm sorry, next slide, please. So I want to end this talk, and I put this slide here because I can talk on and on about this because it is related to my research. By talking about Mitchellville, Mitchellville is a part of, it's a part of Hilton Head. So just to give you a little background and insights from my study. And for most of the first 400 years, one of the reasons that the Gullah Geechee African American culture has been able to persist is because that swamp area was malaria ridden. So foremen did not venture onto that area. What they did instead was, literally, they might go during the day, and there is documentation where people are describing accounts that I'd rather be shot than go there. So as a result, those were few of the Africans who were allowed to continue the drum beating and practices and continue to grow. But things changed. In 1950, we got rid of malaria. And so after we did that, there was a very, very active goal to get rid of the African Americans who were in the coastline. Imagine African American having a coastal view. And so things that have happened is they've done a lot of things. They've filled in the land, and what that led to was the water needed to find a way to go, and so the water kind of went into low-lying areas where African Americans lived. They put up uh, these big homes and gated communities. They're called plantations. If you go down to South Carolina, you'll see they're labeled plantations. And so Hilton Head was predominantly African American. Hilton Head is the spot to go. Everybody sees it as a spot to go. But even currently and right now as we speak, there's an active, very, very active. I mean, it's ongoing to get rid of the remaining African Americans that live there. And so they're in court right now, and it's a court system. And so what they've done is really teamed up with scientists just to help them to see what has happened and even the science behind this. Of course, with money and building, nobody wants to acknowledge that it's not the best idea to go filling in the land there because it's going to lead to more coastal flooding. And so these are the issues that the Gullah Geechee African Americans have been dealing for some time. You can learn about law in the middle of this intersection between law and politics. Here's law. And when African Americans, and again, Mitchellville in this area has to do with an experiment. The experiment was, after African Americans were freed, I wonder if they'll be able to live on their own. Well, they did. They prospered. They built a community. It was beautiful. Well, I guess it was too beautiful when that was the point. And so what they did was instead of assigning individuals land deed, they assigned them to maybe a group of, I don't know, let's just say 100 people. So that if one person, even if the person never been there before, says, oh, I want to sell it, then they take the land from a whole bunch of people. And so you can learn a lot about the intersection between law, the intersection between, why it is that people distrust law. And so very important to think about all of these. As I was going through, today, this week at NARS, looking to see what people were talking about, I think it really showed me that an ever increasing need to talk about this because I saw people talking about distrusting science and I saw people talking about distrusting, these things, but if people don't really they're not contextualizing it and realizing it's not that people don't distrust science. African Americans have been practicing science. They've been making observations about plants. They've been making deductions about what works, what medicine works. They've been doing the heart transplant, right? And so it's not a distrust of science, it's a distrust of people who are using science and who have the power to direct science because we always have to ask the question, who will benefit and who will not? And not only that, not just who will benefit, but who will be harmed. And so it's not a distrust of science, it's a distrust of whose hands the science is in. And I think one example, one of the things you could think about is I think I lost my train of thought here. But one of the things that I come back to is the koi sand. The koi sand, and I showed it in my workshop. I'll try and share the link to you with you so you can see it. One of the things that they belabor, feeling tricked. When you look at missionary statements that describe Africans when they first went to Africa, missionaries would say things like they were docile people who, really don't want anything else. Now, if you look at the glass half full, we could say they're an open people who are content because they have an abundance. And a lot of that is documented, in which I love that Judith Carney shows missionaries and other officials documenting the abundance that we don't really hear about, the abundance that was observed when people went to Africa. And so one of the things they belabored, they felt tricked. So they were trusting. You can say people were trusting, they were open. And the koi Sam said, "Well, we felt tricked because we thought people were nice to us. We thought they were out for our best interest." And they described, well, we feel like we were tricked by a cunning people. And so, next slide, please. And so I want to end by saying that in order to include the lived experiences and narratives, and in order to create educative STEM materials that evoke African heritage, we have to include those lived experiences and narratives and implement adaptation protocols for nature of science. Why did I select nature of science? I think for all my work over the years, one of the things I've seen and really do believe is that nature of science research, I see it as in many ways symbolic. I see it as symbolic of where we are when it comes to inclusion and how far we've come with inclusion. We need to reposition ourselves to a glass half full and not a glass half empty. And I remember Dr. Russell talked about mentoring. And this is something I hear from a lot of people. Mentoring in universities. If we could reposition ourselves with a glass half full, we would mentor differently. Imagine being in a university or in a high school where we perceived Black students, whether in elementary school or university, as potential leaders. That perception will automatically change the way we mentor and change the way we train students. However, in order to get to that repositioning ourselves and having that glass half full, it's important that you confront and understand what impacts your perceptions, what influences your glass half empty perceptions. Because without dealing with that, it's impossible to reposition yourself. And it's impossible to create STEM materials that evoke African American capital without creating qualifiers and without problematizing those accounts. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Any questions? Next slide. Thank you. Any questions? You can feel free to unmute. Dr. Hall, would you mind sharing? I had put two links. The two links, right? One of the links show you what the Gullah Geechee are going through right now, where they're aggressively trying to get rid of them. The other link is if you want to get involved and you want to contribute to it.
They have been put
What's
in
that?
the chat. The
Awesome.
links
Thank you
have
so
been put in
much.
the chat.
Okay. So do we have any questions for our speaker?
Question about the need to build these resources that don't present the Black and African American experience from a problematic perspective. So I'm always looking for those kinds of resources, and I'm wondering if you were able to come across resources that can be shared in teacher education programs to include that expanded perspective of nature of science in general, to include Black and African American experiences and perspectives. So what are some of those resources?
Thank you. I guess that was the problem. I think that there are resources. And one of the things that actually, Dr. Hall, would you mind maybe removing the slide? And if you don't mind sharing those, I'll share them I'll share them during the beginning of that's fine. So one of the things that I've observed in this research, we do have a lot of information about what scientists have done and what different scientists have done. But in addition to making sure there's a positive perspective, I wanted to make sure that it went beyond talking about biographies. It's important for us to know those biographies, but I think that the way those biographies are used give the perception that it's simply something ceremonial and it's not relevant and pertinent to the specific science concept being studied. So I created some video clips in my website, visibilityinstem.com, with interviews and just really, I had to do a lot of just extracting what those narratives are. And that's one of the things I'm writing and working on right now. What is a methodology for actually doing that, extracting those positive narratives and thinking about what it might look like? And so, yes and no. Think that even though there are a lot of historical accounts, I keep in mind that 90% of I'm sorry, 80% of our teachers are white. Uh, and we have standards that we ask students to uphold to, we ask teachers to uphold to. And so part of what I'm doing in the video, I know it's hard to see it on the website. You might need to, if you scroll to let that white part show, just select videos. And so I started creating videos as well as animations I only did one so far, with feedback from different people, talking to different people about it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And I'm glad that you shared the website. And also, I know that there obviously are researchers who are doing a lot of good research around African American and Black perspectives in science. A challenge that I have teaching undergraduates is finding resources that are written at a level that they can grasp. So I put that call out to everybody here. If you can share any resources that I can use with my undergraduates, articles, videos, etc., that would be very
Absolutely. If you look at my profiles for the a lot of my, I shouldn't say a lot, a couple of my articles, I intentionally wrote it for that reason, for the practitioners. I started doing, look, the one I wrote was African raw art image analysis, just to give a little background of the historical account. And there's some handouts and teacher guides. And the other one I talked about, why use the interest. I think that that one works well for practitioners. I will post that link as well. Those articles are available for free download from ABT. But also that's the issue. When I was teaching high school, a lot of people asked, well, I shouldn't even say that. Yeah, administrators were asking us questions like, include diversity, right? And as a teacher, well, what does that mean? That's going to take an enormous amount of time if I'm not just showing a video of a scientist. And that's really what led me to delving into the work. As a matter of fact, I thought of just doing this in general because we were just really absent in a meaningful way. And so my goal is by the end of this summer, I'm hoping that I will have at least completed one full unit. And actually, that reminds me, I'm glad you asked that. I'm going to put a link if anybody wants to be involved with either testing it out or whenever I have a webinar. I've had some webinars that I've invited, so feel free to include your name and email, or if you want to give reactions, I'll use it to report to NSF too, and including my study. You're welcome to. So,
Okay,
um,
thank you so much, Catherine. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, but
thank
we
you.
do have to move on because we have some posters that we need to present.
And thank you so much for this privilege.